will be dealing with here. There will be occasions when I'll be talking about like this, and some other occasions when I'll be talking like this.
Yes, folks, welcome to Left Reckoning. There will be some occasions when I'm talking like this, and there will be some occasions when I'm talking like this. With you, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited to dig into Abbott. He seems like a very interesting guy. I'd like to see somebody, practice emotions as their mic checker.
Yes. By the way, I will talk about this later, but in the context of like a deadly storm that killed likely around 700 people, something else.
Yeah. But we got a great show for you. Nick Bowlin, who was he a Patreon episode or was he on the main show?
He was on the main show, yeah.
He's returning to tell us about some good news we got out of Denver, Colorado, and some Starbucks at the barn. Starbucks on Colfax Street, I think it is in Denver. So very excited to get the background of those workers who decided to unanimously form a union yesterday.
Hell, it's incredibly bright news. Very much needed.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking a little bit about Montana later, and also a quick update on Palestine. And as always, don't forget to join us in the post-game patreon.com/leftreckoning, where Matt and I are going to do a little bit of our segment, We Told You So, around Bitcoin, but then talk about some of the very, very difficult consequences that happen when you basically have a large-scale endorsed grift that pulls in a lot of people towards the end and wipes their savings away. Truly devastating story.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be less of a victory lap and more of a modeling how not to be a sociopath, because we all know that if the promise of Bitcoin somehow proved to bail out, or proved to pan out, then they would be saying, sorry for being poor, you folks.
Mm-hmm.
But really what it is a lot of people online that are really annoying and going to get washed out by this. And like, there's some degree of schadenfreude, I suppose. But a lot of other people who look to it as a speculative investment, like stocks, for instance, which is how people get really ahead in this country. Let's be real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the new version of that. So you want to get on the ground floor, just look at Matt Damon and Spike Lee. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it really is upsetting that this is going to happen. And frankly, I hope that we could somehow get a soft landing from something like this. But
totally. Well, before we get into our story too, just want to remind folks, we always appreciate your call. So give us a call at 1-940-289-7234, 940-289-7234. Leave us a voicemail. We'll play it in the post game and answer your questions and hear your stories and hang out. So be sure to do that. See y'all then. But yeah, should we talk about this COVID story, this Abbott story here? So we,
sorry, I was muted.
I have a story that came out today in the brand new Sublation magazine, which y'all should definitely be checking out. They're going to be publishing a lot of really great pieces in the near future. It's run by a lot of different folks, but folks you would know, our friend Gene Bajelon, and also Doug Lane, who has also launched Sublation Books as well. But Gene asked me to write this piece, and I figured it's worth going over again on this program because it's an interesting story. One, just because of the political consequences and what Abbott's doing here in Texas. But two, because it really shows it's a kind of a counter narrative, I think, to some people sort of on the left who I think understandably have, worries and criticisms of state power and state overreach. And we saw a lot of that in the early COVID days. I mean, quite devastatingly, for example, in New York, where you had Cuomo exerting a lot of personal power and also hiding, mass deaths in, nursing homes and things of that nature. But a lot of times when people talk about COVID, they're focusing when they're talking about making these criticisms, they're sort of focusing on the level of policy, right? Do you support mandates or do you not support mandates? Do you support lockdowns or do you not support lockdowns? And I think at least in Texas that conversation really misses the point. You have a lot of kind of right-wing folks who moved to Texas in the past 2 years, specifically because they like that Abbott had a kind of live and let live philosophy towards COVID. But that philosophy is extremely limited when it comes to the amount of power that Abbott wants to pull to himself. So This has been happening every month since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Greg Abbott will extend a disaster declaration over the COVID-19 pandemic. And, I know it's different everywhere else, but here in Texas, I mean, you very rarely have seen a mask anywhere. Really the only kind of relics of that system are just sort of old paper, posters on the outside of businesses sort of outlining COVID protocols that are frankly non-existent at this point. But Abbott, despite the fact that he's been very much anti-mandate, he's been waging war on local authorities, city authorities, county authorities, school systems over any kind of very basic COVID protocols. While he's been waging those wars, sort of saying that like the time of the mandates are over, he hasn't wanted to relinquish the emergency powers that came with the early pandemic, and has been using them quite successfully. Most notably, he has extended the COVID-19 disaster declaration to the border and to immigration. This has been over the fight over Title 42, which was a Trump-era policy that basically denied people their basic human rights, their basic asylum rights to enter the country as political, people seeking asylum. Trump blocked that. And the Biden administration has signaled that that they're thinking about pulling that back in the near future. Abbott declared a COVID-19 disaster declaration for the border counties, include actually 34 counties. So some of those counties aren't even directly on the border, citing that he's worried that immigrants are going to bring COVID-19 into Texas. Just very ironic for somebody who is, not very worried about it being spread by anybody else except for, immigrants from the Americas. He has used this, the powers that he's used, because if people aren't familiar with Texas politics, and I think even a lot of Texans aren't familiar with this because we've been living through a couple decades that have really shifted the office of the governor. The governor's office in Texas is what's called a weak governor system. The people who created the Constitution in 1876 were very worried, rightfully or wrongfully, about a very strong executive, and they wanted to limit the executive power as much as possible. For a long time, governors in Texas were only elected for extremely short terms. But most importantly, the powers of the governor were extremely limited. One, because they weren't able to set up a cabinet, and that's pretty much how most governors are able to exert their executive authority in other states in the country, because they're able to basically put somebody in, whatever their equivalent of a labor department is, or health department, or something like that. In Texas, most of those boards are they're either elected directly or they are appointed on a staggered basis, so that no one governor would basically be able to control the entirety of those boards. That started to change when the Democratic Party completely imploded in this state, because now after years and years and years of GOP rule, most of those people who are appointed to those boards, and even many of the people who are elected to them, are loyal to the Republican Party. Rick Perry, the former governor, really changed this into a kind of clientelist system, where basically everybody who was on these state boards was extremely loyal to him. They were going to do what he said. And Abbott inherited that and has only deepened, just like the amount of power and influence he has over these people. A lot of this is about money. Abbott is an incredible fundraiser. We'll give him that. He loves to schmooze and talk on the phone to boys. Rich boys at least, and he rewards them with positions, in his government. But if that were just the story, it'd be interesting. It'd be notable for people in Texas. But it is this extension of power that he has gotten with this disaster declaration. The disaster declaration in Texas was set up in the 70s. So that a governor in a situation like a hurricane or a massive flood would just be able to move resources quickly to be able to make sure that Texas' needs were being taken care of. And it's a very, very broad disaster power. It really allows them to override all the kind of checks and distribution of power in the state and centralize power in the governor. Again, as I said, something that was completely, was something that the people who wrote the Constitution of Texas did never want to see happen. And Abbott has now continued to extend this disaster declaration to such an extent that now Florida and New York They had much shorter disaster declarations. This is the longest disaster declaration in Texas's history. And, people remember probably a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about what he did at the border, where he basically set up a second system of checkpoints that let food rot on trucks, slow down production and distribution of goods that are coming not just into Texas, but the entire country, and cost, upwards of, a couple $1 billion in lost revenue and trade because of this really insane move that he was doing. And remember, I mean, like, not that we would want it to be efficient or a good inspection, but it was so symbolic. They weren't actually able to even investigate what was inside of truck cargo. They were only able to do basically truck safety checks. And yeah, there were a few trucks that were found unsafe to drive. Their headlights didn't work or their brake pads were a little worn. And, maybe that was good, preventing an accident or something like that. But he said he was trying to stop fentanyl and human trafficking. And I'll tell you all this right now, that if they found anything, you would know about it by now.
They're smuggling fentanyl in the brake pads. And they found some. Yeah.
And I'm trying to because I want to talk about the National Guard in a second. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. People should read the piece. I break down a lot of this history and how he's used his power and the kind of legality around it. Sorry, Matt.
I was just gonna say, go read and share David's piece.
No, I appreciate that. But I wanted to focus specifically on this National Guard story and Operation Lone Star, because this is a very, very worrying story here. So for people who aren't familiar, it goes along with what I was just talking about with the kind of second checkpoint that they set up at the border. But Abbott has deployed thousands of Texas National Guard members to the border to basically run a parallel operation to the federal government. And if you're already worried about what Abbott is doing inside the state of Texas, you should also be worried about a state governor, going and trying to negotiate treaties with Mexican governors. That is not a power that state governors have to basically be able to operate as if they're their own independent country. And all that you can see from what Abbott has learned in this period of time, these past 2 years, is that he can get away with this. And the GOP is unwilling to stand up and to challenge him on this. When the Democrats were trying to run their protest against SB 8 here, which was the anti-abortion bill, a bunch of Democrats fled the state of Texas to basically prevent there from being quorum so that they couldn't actually pass the bill. And Abbott waged war on the legislature, not just Democrats, but Republicans as well, and pulled back funding for all staffers who work in the Texas legislature. And you got a little bit of kicking, a little bit of complaining, but the GOP completely acquiesced to Abbott, really, really running this state like a tyrant. And ignoring the separation of powers, and most importantly, ignoring the intention of the system, which was to have the most power sort of held in the legislature. He's used his veto power at an extreme rate, and he's using these executive orders, which again has never really been a big part of how you run the state of Texas. For the most part, even in Abbott's early administration, most of these executive orders or orders from the governor are things like, let's put some funding to help a group of people who are suffering after a hurricane, or to say, we want to have a celebration for former President George Bush to honor him as a great Texas man, right? Like symbolic stuff, and then just kind of very, very general, unoffensive reshuffling for the most part of funds. But going back to Operation Lone Star, because this is a huge scandal here, man. They have held about, I think it's about 6,500 people. They've deployed about 6,500 people to the border. Abbott is also adamant about building a border wall. He's using this executive authority that he has taken to override and basically just ignore the legislature to reapportion more and more and more money to the border in this failed operation to the tune of something like $4 billion. Some of that came from the legislature, but a lot of that came from Abbott basically reshuffling money using these executive powers that he's taken for himself. But if it was just about a waste of money, it also has to be noted too that this whole thing, if you think about $4 billion with very little oversight, has just been a cash cow for private contractors with little to no oversight. If it was just about, the way that they're spending money, it'd be a scandal. But it gets much, much, much worse because the people who are being called up to the border, these Texas National Guardsmen, are working under absolutely brutal conditions. you have to remember that there's a big difference between being called up for a federal mission if you're in the National Guard versus a state mission. Most importantly, pay is less. You don't have access to the federal healthcare system, and if you're killed in action, you get workers' comp. Your family gets workers' comp after you pass, and you have to go through all of these kind of bureaucratic loophole, bureaucratic processes to even get it. And a lot of those people end up failing to collect their paperwork and turn their paperwork in a way that's accessible to the state, and they either don't get it paid out or it gets delayed significantly. Versus if you're killed in action on a federal mission, your family gets $100,000 immediately. That's it, done. And this matters because just earlier in April, a Texas National Guardsman drowned. Bishop Evans drowned while jumping into the Rio Grande to save a migrant family who was trying to cross the river. The most basic human thing. You're seeing somebody suffer and you want to help out them. You want to help them out. And he's not alone. Warning, I'll talk about suicides in a second. But there has been a real uptick of National Guardsmen who have been committing suicide, because you have to remember that these are people who have civilian jobs on the top of this. You pull them away for months on end on a mission that most of them recognize is useless and is symbolic, and they're being used as political tools by the governor. They're losing their jobs, they're losing their income, and they're worried about what's going to happen to their family and their life when they come back from the service. It's very, very bleak, and we'll look at some of the examples in just one second. But I also wanted to note, they're giving this mission has been a huge boon to private contractors, has been a huge waste of taxpayer money in the state of Texas, and it doesn't seem like it's being run on any kind of drop the politics, drop the morality, anything like this, just basic how you run an operation of this scale. It is a mess. When Bishop Evans drowned, there was a big investigation as to how this could happen. And the leaders of the operation were asked, is there a protocol for guardsmen when it comes to entering the water in this kind of situation? They said no. Are guardsmen given flotation devices, right, which you think would be a very, very basic, kind of protocol? No. When we're talking about the Texas border, we're talking about a river. We're talking about a big river, and there's no protocol about whether or not you should be coming into the water, getting safety equipment for people. I mean, it's a huge scandal. And now, instead of doing those kind of basic things, National Guardsmen have been told that if they see somebody drowning, to watch them drown and to not come and save them. Absolutely inhuman and disgusting, kind of leadership there. But let's talk about this, because there's an exciting development on this piece too. When it does come to the National Guard, let me just read it just to paint the picture a little bit more. This is from my piece. This is an interview that was done by Army Times with different National Guards members. I'm wasting time watching the grass grow at my observation point along the border while my civilian job is dying on the vine. If we could pull up this Army Times piece, Matt. There's a few other things that are worth noting. In this kind of, Army Times went and they interviewed a bunch of guardsmen. As many as 1 in 5 troops in the 6,500 strong operational force who have been sent to the border have reported problems with their pay, which also, remember, is less than they would be getting if they were getting a federal mission. 2, including being paid late, too little, or not at all for months. I mean, imagine that. You have a family to take care of and you're just getting no income. You're losing your civilian job.
It needs to be stressed. That's why they've joined this thing in the fucking first place. This isn't, out of the most part, patriotism, like serving their country, which is what the right will want to present this as, right? This is about people not having enough to support a family, joining up to become a National Guards person, and then being used as a political pawn like this. This comes up when we talk about benefits and stuff. How are we going, if we just extend healthcare and pay to all these people, how are we going to get recruits to the military and to National Guard? It's that's why, is they like that. And so the double impact you're saying is I can't imagine being in that fucking position, that this is not what you signed up for, where it's actually putting you behind and they're not even fucking paying you.
Totally. And the conditions are horrible. Noted here, many are living in cramped trailers with dozens of troops. I mean, imagine being on assignment like that, and then also like having the realization too that there's no reason for you to be there in the first place. Again, even by the standards that the right wants, this has not been a successful operation when it comes to stopping drug trafficking, things of that nature. Some say they feel underutilized and rarely even see migrants while working in isolated observation posts that in some cases lack portable toilets for months. Service members have struggled with shortages of critical equipment, including cold weather gear, medical equipment, and plates for their ballistic vests. If you want to pull up this next story here, because they're not just accepting it, and this is actually it's a pretty interesting precedent here, and we'll be following this as it continues to develop. But this is in Jacobin. It's been reported elsewhere as well. Texas soldiers are unionizing after facing attacks by a right-wing governor. The people in the National Guard who are, again, facing these horrific conditions, just abused by the governor, abused by the system, are being underpaid. And also remember that oftentimes these guys are doing missions because Biden has also mobilized. There is a federal mission, too, that's mobilized National Guard troops to the border as well. So oftentimes they're working next to somebody who has the benefits and the pay and the protections that they're not getting because they were called up by Greg Abbott. But these soldiers are now actively unionizing. Now, for people who aren't familiar, in the United States, because in the Vietnam War, there was a lot of organizing amongst soldiers to actually create a kind of proto-union force that was going to be able to push back against the abuse that they were facing and push back against the barbaric war in Vietnam. The United States government effectively outlawed any kind of labor organization or made it illegal to be a member of a labor organization if you're in the military. But earlier this year, the Justice Department released a document saying that National Guardsmen who are pulled up by their governor on a state mission are allowed to join the state employees union. So this is a very, very new thing. This is not something that's been around for a while, and people are taking advantage of this moment here in Texas and are trying to organize National Guardsmen, the 6,500 member force here, into a union so that they can get the kind of basic protections that they need, so that they can get helped out. They have an uphill fight because remember, if you're on deployment, they control every aspect of your life. Think about the shit that they're doing to people at Starbucks. Imagine if you lived there, right? It's an uphill fight, but it's a very encouraging one, I must say.
I was shocked to even find that this was allowable, that even for domestic stuff. But I think what it's amazing is and the optimistic takeaway is that this shows a rising consciousness for the power of collective bargaining and forming unions, because we're seeing it everywhere now, right? You see it at Amazon, Starbucks. Starbucks, a place that traditionally wasn't thought of as a hospitable ground, and now National Guards folks. And that's not because of the squad. It's not because of media. It's because of the conditions. And it's heartening to see so many people go down this route. And I think it's just our responsibility to keep this going as best we can.
Totally. And I think it's very exciting. And I think it would also be good, politically too, to have the soldiers themselves challenging Abbott on all of this. Maybe just to end, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Matt. I mean, the reason I've been interested in this story as it's sort of been developing, and I've been interested in it, I've sort of following this for a while now, is that I think that a lot of, as I said at the top, a lot of the criticisms of kind of COVID era policy from the government, who were saying, oh, the government's overstepping its reach, they're sort of asserting powers for themselves, were so hyper-focused on the policies themselves, right? And I think oftentimes more reflected how you felt about, wearing a mask or not, than the actual question of whether or not this is good for democracy. Because here in Texas, they don't have the mandates, but we have seen an unprecedented centralization of power that is quite dangerous. It's having consequences. And it doesn't seem like there is any, motivation on Abbott's part to limit this. And as long as the GOP is in control of the legislature, there is very little check on this. It's very much under the radar kind of stuff, which is how Abbott operates. It's worth noting, just if people aren't familiar with this, Greg Abbott is in a wheelchair because when he was younger, he was hit by a tree that fell when he was out for a jog. And Abbott sued the tree company that worked on the tree and the homeowner. And I think got somewhere near, I have it in here, $11 million or something like that. $11 million at the end of his settlement, which I think is going to be paid out. Yeah, $11 million, which will be paid out at the end of this year in full. And then when he got onto the Supreme Court, and then when he was an attorney general, Abbott campaigned ferociously to limit non-medical expenses from any kind of personal injury lawsuit, where it is now capped at just $250,000. So this is somebody who benefited from a system that allowed him to collect millions of dollars, and is now blocking other people today from being able to sue and get those kind of damages for themselves. Right? He's somebody who very much floats whichever way the wind goes. When Bush was in power, he was a Bush-style Republican. Trump's in power, he's now a Trumpy guy. He's devastating the state with his just love affair with these kind of this super privatized grid. They have done very, very little to weatherize and protect Texans from the failure that ended up killing 700 people. And he sees a golden opportunity here. I'll give him this, right? He's got a very sharp legal mind, and he understands how to play this game well. That's how he rose to power in Texas politics, because he was somebody who could get things done. What motivates him is a bit of a question. I would argue that it's money. This is somebody who always follows the campaign contributions. And in a system like Texas's, in a system that Abbott runs, he rewards these guys in a big way. He got $4.6 million in donations after the winter storm happened from the very companies who he should have been, coming at and regulating and forcing to weatherize the grid. And the point here is about, the COVID-19 powers that governors and mayors and, even the federal government enjoyed. I think that it's 100% an accurate question to say there needs to be challenges and abilities to call back these emergency powers, because we're seeing here, there is no real horizon to Abbott's emergency powers. And I think he's going to continue to use this as long as it's viable for him, which could be a very, very long time.
Right, certainly longer than Democrats are willing to use emergency powers for anything like getting people to stay at home or something like that. Which is, you see how this stuff sticks is to put the screws to workers generally. Yeah. My general take is just a frustration with what's the imperative of the ruling class during the COVID era? It's to get people's ass back to work. Right, yep. That's what the National Restaurant Associations and shit, that's what all these lobbying organizations that run Congress are interested in. But you can't just say that, because John Taffer tried to just say that and he had to issue an apology later, yeah. Right? And so you have to find these other ways to say it. And this libertarian concern, which I agree, theoretically it could be there are things like this Title 42 is concerning. I also am not. It makes me sick to my stomach to think about all the people that lost jobs because they were afraid of a vaccine that our media couldn't message clearly about, and they might have got misled or whatever. But fundamentally, you have to look at this thing from the worker's perspective, which is that makes me sick. It makes me sicker that people are forced into a pandemic to go work in conditions that aren't safe. And frankly, both parties have incentives to downplay this, the severity of this stuff. And so, that's I agree. I wish we did have room for the conversation, I theoretically, I like the conversation of let's be, there's a lot of people that think we had that conversation and we never had it.
No, we
right.
Didn't,
the one you're talking about, right? We had this instead one where it's what if we're forced to wear masks forever, and the government is coming around every 4 months and injecting us with Democrat voter serum, and we didn't have the one, which is the fundamental one, which is where do the business owners want to take society and where are they taking us?
And like, it's just worth noting too, like to your point, Matt, like, you know, it's just like for me, like the reason I want to write this piece and I've been focusing on it is because again, people are always like, well, Abbott's not doing anything. It's like that's just not the case, right? So Abbott was, you know, as you were saying, like what did the capitalist class want when the COVID-19 pandemic started? They want everybody to get back to work. You know, not all capitalists, but you know, some of them were sort of happy with you know, this kind of isolated situation. But a lot of them did want, especially their low wage workers, to be forced to come back and do the kind of necessary services that keep society running. So what happens? Abbott gets incredible amount of campaign contributions from these guys, and then he uses the emergency powers that came with the disaster declaration to override city level mandates. Right. So he was the one who was bought, who ended up having the power to basically be able to override all other government authority. And I'd also argue, you know, not to be starry eyed about local government, but local government is at least closer and arguably a little bit more reflective for most people than state government, at least here. Right. Because you have cities like Austin and Houston and Dallas, which are run by very different people than Abbott and his gang. So he finds a way to basically be able to override all of the small government in Texas, you know, for the benefit of, you know, these folks using COVID-19 disaster declaration as the way to go. But before we leave, we sort of skipped over the winter storm here. I think we have to play this clip one more time because, you know, if you're not familiar with Abbott, he is not a very skilled orator. He's a great fundraiser. He's good at coming up with ways to waste resources and put people's lives at risk, but speaking is not one of his strong suits. And this is a hot mic
We will
clip.
be dealing with here. There will be occasions.
This is a hot mic clip from the winter storm, which, you know, again, killed between, you know, estimates are between like 400 and 900 people died, froze to death. After this, many Texans were faced with, you know, power bills, and if their power didn't go off, we're faced with power bills $16,000, $17,000, right? A huge crisis. I mean, talking to family and friends, you know, you will just hear just devastating stories of the suffering that people are going through, and also, you know, some very beautiful and inspiring stories of people coming together, opening up their house to each other, and things like that. But anyways, here's Abbott at a state crisis, coming to speak to the state of Texas. And here's him practicing some very basic human emotion.
We will be dealing with here. There will be occasions when I'll be talking about like this, and some other occasions when I'll be talking like this.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Is that good enough?
It is, Ab. So there'll be more in the future. I mean, we'll definitely be watching this National Guard story because I think this is a huge scandal, and I think Abbott and his boys need to be hit on this a hell of a lot more than they are. It's absolutely devastating.
I'm kind of surprised that like the sort of mainstream Democratic media hasn't flagged this as like usually they love to rally around the flag, and these are troops. I mean, I'm kind of, you know, a little bit confused.
I mean, they, you know, in fairness, like in the sense of like, have people said stuff? I mean, Beto talks about this, but none of it has bubbled up really. I mean, you know, and I think that's a kind of legitimacy crisis and a trust crisis for people like Beto with most people. But I totally agree, Matt. Like, I think they should be getting hit a hell of a lot more than they are. I think, you know, sometimes with these things, they try it once, and if it doesn't land immediately, they give up.
Which I mean is
Left Reckoning.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you just look at the way Republicans just repeat the dumbest shit until it becomes like a minor movement. Like,
Totally.
like you have true things that you can run on, and like it's like, oh shit, pro union. Like we're supposed to be that now. I mean, the fucking like the bureaucracy is more fucking pro union than the Democrats are at this point.
Well, y'all, we got a really exciting, talking about union stuff. We got a really exciting conversation coming up for y'all with Nick Bowlin, who is an absolute must read and must follow. He has a piece in The Guardian. You can find the link in the show notes to it, about the trials and struggles that these people in Denver had in this union campaign. He wrote it before the final tally was in. So you know, this was recorded on Monday, but yesterday, and let me share this with y'all. Yesterday afternoon, we got the results. I guess we got two, but we got the results here. that the group in the Denver Starbucks voted unanimously to form a union with Starbucks Workers United. Here's the photograph of those brave folks celebrating. It's a hell of a story. Nick really paints a very compelling picture as to the struggles that these folks were facing. And we also talk a little bit about Colorado's hidden labor history. So I hope you all enjoy, and we'll see you all on the other side. We've got a few more segments after that too.
And yeah, here we are, folks. See you in about 45 minutes.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by our good friend Matt Leck.
Hello there.
And we're joined again by a return guest, Nick Bowlin, who is a reporter with High Country News. You should definitely check out the interview we did with him just a few weeks ago about why Democrats are losing rural America. But we wanted to bring him on today to talk about something very specific to Colorado that is also touching on this big national story. And that is this Starbucks union campaign. He has a great piece that y'all should check out in The Guardian called Pure Propaganda Inside Starbucks Anti-Union Tactics. And we're really thrilled to have him on to sort of break down this piece. Thank you so much, Nick, for hanging out with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Well, totally, man. Well, let's just jump right into it. We're going to talk a little bit about Starbucks, and then towards the end, we're actually going to hear a little bit about Colorado and the area's labor history, which will be really interesting. But before we get there, we're talking about a campaign in Denver. And for people who might not be familiar with what's been going on the ground, particularly for like working people, what's the kind of state of play right now for the average person in Denver, Colorado?
So, yeah, in Denver over the past decade or so, cost of living has just skyrocketed, with most of that increase based with housing costs. There's been Denver's economy is really driven by these kind of like big, fast moving economic forces like aerospace and tech and finance. But for the sort of person who makes most of their income or all of their income from Starbucks, it's just really hard to live in Denver these days. And, this is kind of the context in which my story took place, is that, these workers who've worked at Starbucks for years, and in some cases when they began, they could live fairly comfortably. They can't anymore, and that this was an impetus for them to think about unionizing when the kind of nationwide Starbucks union push began back in December.
Yeah, and I mean, this is like why this story is both particular and sort of universal at this point, where like so many people who work for a wage are really struggling to be able to continue to, support themselves while also providing very, very necessary services for their community. This location is pretty interesting, and it's a pretty interesting location. They call it the Barn, if I recall correctly. It's
That's
a really
right.
fascinating building. When Matt comes back on, we'll put up an image of it. But could you talk a little bit too, in addition to the housing crisis, what were some of the conditions particular to this Starbucks in particular that sort of were encouraging people to unionize, and what was really behind the drive for this union campaign?
Sure. So the barn, and yeah, when you pull it up, it really does look like a barn. It's on, if you know Denver, it's one of kind of the more famous main drags in Denver. It's called Colfax Avenue, and it's got a lot of the kind of iconic Denver restaurants and music venues, old theaters, that kind of thing. And, the workers there say that, and this is a thing for Starbucks baristas, there tend to be a lot of Starbucks in close proximity to one another, and it's common for workers at one location to share shifts at others if people need help. But the barn's kind of notorious in Denver because the pace is really fast. The it kind of has a reputation which the workers describe to me as not really necessarily earned, like overblown a little bit, as this kind of like rough and tumble Starbucks. So like a lot of the suburban locations, Starbucks, look like the baristas from there tend to not really pick up shifts at the barn. But one of the things that this does is it creates like a very tight knit group of employees. And they do have to deal with a lot of stuff. I think this is pretty universal across the service industry, but people have been pretty nasty during the pandemic times. One of the guys I interviewed for the story was punched by a customer because of a mask mandate thing. And another one of the kind of main characters in my story, she was pepper sprayed in the face in the drive-through window by a customer who was mad that they were out of Frappuccinos. Sounded like, I talked to her, and they sounded like the follow-up there was perhaps some sort of mental health crisis going on there, but yeah, I mean, they've really been through it, and they say that by and large the Starbucks management, they haven't been helpful or receptive to concerns about safety. And so again, the first Starbucks to unionize was in Buffalo in December. And when that happened, I mean, they said there was just this kind of outpouring of, in the staff group chat, just like, what could a union do for us? Like, would be able to bargain for some of these protections that, or workplace safety stuff the management wouldn't give us, or increased wages, which, have stagnated in recent years and have gone towards corporate profits rather than towards the baristas. And yeah, I mean, I think that the tight knit nature of the barn really contributed to them announcing a union drive pretty early, because there were a lot of them who were supportive of the union and others who weren't, but were able to kind of like be brought along by their coworkers. So yeah, they announced in January, which it took a very long time for the NLRB to give them a vote, but they announced very early on. And I think some of that has to be chalked up to the kind of specifics of that workplace.
Yeah, I mean, it just is. I just wanted to note really quick that like in like the complete defunding of like public space that we're seeing in cities, it's like Starbucks and like those kind of places end up being very important for the community. And these people are having to do, multiple roles at once, like one providing a service and coffee, and also maintaining an environment for people of many different walks of life, people who have different needs, etc. And one of the things that was like notable, I think, in your piece, and you've touched on it already, but like, is that there's a demand. Obviously, like we want better pay, we want better security for ourselves, we want better benefits, all that kind of stuff. But there's also these secondary. They're not secondary, but like they're attached to it demands. Like we need the company to also be showing up and supporting us and supporting the workers if we're going to be doing this kind of work that is sort of necessary for maintaining our jobs right now.
Absolutely. And Starbucks has been around for decades now. There are, I think, 9,000 stores in the US. And it's been a target, or at least maybe not even a target, but union organizers have been interested in making inroads there for years and years. And one of the reasons they haven't been able to is because Starbucks tended to have pretty good benefits and pay pretty well. I think, one of the reasons why you're now, in addition to some other things like pay hasn't really kept up, it used to be better than it is relative to inflation, that the pandemic and the working conditions and the fact that, people who serve coffee had to go to work every day while others, got to work from home. I think that really did kind of broaden the possibilities for labor organizing and accelerated them maybe in a way that, kind of, yeah, I mean, 6 months ago, there were 0 Starbucks unionized in the US. And now I think there are more than 60 successful campaigns and like almost 300 ongoing. And I mean, the just awful conditions that they had to endure during the pandemic, I think really contributed to that.
And the pepper spray incident, This part like captures so much of what's going wrong in America. So you have this mental health crisis, which underpaid workers are on the front lines of dealing with at all these major corporations. It's not these union busting management that has to deal with any people that either hate masks or have some other crisis that's not being addressed. And like you say, like what's so brave about what these people are doing is they do rely on those health benefits because we don't have those universalized throughout the country, which is partially why you have this crisis everywhere that these workers have to deal with. It's such like it's a mess.
No, it really is. And, this was one of the things that, the Starbucks workers were, one of the things one of the quotes that stood out to me, it's in the story. One of the workers said, like Starbucks was one of the first American companies to give some manner of health benefits to part-time workers. It's like that's a really good thing. That's why people seek out Starbucks often and have historically. But she said to me, like, the company doesn't get to, like, if you give us some benefits, you don't get to tell us like that's enough. Mm-hmm. But the company is trying to do that, and she said, okay, well, like then we're going to form a union and push for some more, because like we said, they can't really live in Denver on a Starbucks salary as it stands right now, or it's really, really hard to. And they're saying, we're grateful that Starbucks has better benefits than maybe some other large corporations, but rather than them being kind of like benevolently granted to us from on high, like, we want to create a union and go bargain for our own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like these major corporations, and like Amazon makes a show of like, look, we support the fight for 15 guys. Like all these corporations, these major retailers, these major corporations that employ a lot of people under a living wage, they could tomorrow make Congress extend those rights to people, extend healthcare to folks, and this, that, and the other. And they don't, because they like it as a cudgel that they can just give it to dispense whatever workers are going to frankly unionize and are going to put up with being understaffed all the time, and that are going to put up with that. You get a little bit of healthcare, nobody else.
Well, and this has been, just displayed to a somewhat shocking extent in the past couple of weeks, because I'm sure you guys saw this, but Howard Schultz announced this like pretty robust benefit expansion to Starbucks employees. It was going to be an immediate pay raise, with then a greater pay raise coming in the fall, tiered to experience level. This is kind of shocking to me, that they don't have credit card tipping at Starbucks. You can tip in the app and you can tip cash, but people don't carry cash anymore and no one uses the app. But they're going to implement credit card tipping, which is going to really increase their wages this fall. There was other stuff about like some financial service help and other, health benefits. But Schultz said they only want to expand it for non-union stores, employees, in this attempt to pit unionized against non-unionized employees. Probably rightfully so, the union is taking full credit for this. Like, you wouldn't have done this out of the goodwill of your heart. You're only doing this because this wildly successful union campaign has blindsided you all, and now you're, desperately trying to put a roadblock in the way. There's a question of legality that might violate good faith bargaining laws, and discrimination laws, that you can't expand benefits to only a few of your employees. But then, there's the issue of they could have done this all along. They only did it when there's this wildfire union campaign that's sweeping the nation.
Yeah, and also, a lot of things can be illegal, but as we've learned time and time again, these big corporations, they have the ability to sit and wait out challenges, and they're sort of banking on that to try to bust unions in the meantime. In addition to that, Starbucks corporate culture has their whole kind of very progressive veneer. They call everybody a partner. but they're not partners enough to make their own decisions about whether they want to be in a union or not. The company is now trying to pit union versus non-union workers again against each other. And also in your story, you note that this location has seen a lot of attention from like Starbucks figures. Could you talk a little bit about, who's coming down there and what they're saying to the workers there?
Sure. So shortly after, they announced your union push in late January, the workers there say it was pretty immediate. And I was talking to them pretty early on that figures from kind of the corporate or even, kind of regional Starbucks hierarchy began appearing in the store in a way that, they never had before. Sometimes just kind of sitting there and watching and taking notes, other times nitpicking them about stuff like name tags or very minor uniform stuff that, they said had never been an issue in the past. Over the span of a couple days in February, every worker in that store had to do a one-on-one or two-on-one meeting with some of these corporate figures where they were kind of grilled about what they knew about the union, whether they supported the union, and there were kind of vague insinuations made about benefits. So, they can never say this would violate the law. You're going to lose your benefits if you unionize. What they can say is, we can't promise you that your benefits won't get worse, which is what, many employees I interviewed at that store said they were told. And then, there were, things got worse. My story begins with this anecdote for one of the more experienced employees who was definitely a union advocate, who was grilled by this corporate investigator about taking food home at the end of shifts. And to be clear, this isn't like stealing food. This is like taking expired fruit or expired granola bars that would either be like, they put it in this box that sometimes goes to local food pantries, but the box doesn't always get picked up. So he's like, if I see an apple in the box that's turning brown, like either throw it away or take it home. Or like, they throw away a box of granola bars that's expired and, you grab some. And, he said before the union thing, my manager, the district manager, everyone knows we do this. It's maybe not like condoned, but it's never been a problem in the years he worked at Starbucks. And he had to endure this call, which I got an audio recording of him just grilling him about taking food home. So he quit that day, but he suspected it was going to justify him being pre-fired. There's this kind of thing where you're kind of one step from being fired, and several of the leading union organizers were written up after never having been disciplined in any way. And there's this gradation of punishments. So they got the most severe punishment before being fired for, violations that they said were either minor or fabricated. Several of the leading union organizers did. One of them was eventually fired. Several other employees were said that they just abruptly had an issue getting enough hours, which seems kind of ridiculous, right? It's like, it seems like every business in America is short-staffed right now, but they would people who were expecting 30, 40 hours a week at Starbucks suddenly find themselves struggling to get 25, 28. And like I said, Denver's expensive, and suddenly they'd find themselves behind on rent. And the workers' speculation was this is one attempt to demoralize them and get them to quit so that they could hire new employees and potentially shift the union vote. And then two, they were kind of hoping if, you short staff, really busy store, there'll kind of be, resentment among the staff because, stuff's going poorly, drinks are being, mismanaged, or orders are going unfilled, and people are kind of stop sniping at each other if everyone hates each other. I don't think that happened, but that was their guess for why those tactics. So the ones who are still there, and a few people quit. I think we're up to 8 have either been quit or fired since this whole thing began. They say it's pretty miserable working there now. In a way that it was not before the union campaign. But for a lot of them, this is their main source of income. And even if they're looking for other jobs, they have to show up to work every day.
And like this is like the national playbook for Starbucks at this point. Like this is they did this in Arizona. They did this in Memphis where they were coming in, and it was an impossible situation to figure out what Starbucks was going to get mad at you for. They're getting mad at employees for showing up early to their shift. They were getting mad at employees for staying late. And it always seemed to happen that the people who were just getting these kind of strange violations that were atypical were people who were heavily involved in in the unionizing.
I will say that the Denver Starbucks definitely put themselves, I think, put a target on their collective backs because they did a 6-hour strike and walkout before they formed a union, which is, I think
that's brave.
Yeah, it's brave. It was March 11th. They, walked in, said, under our NLRB rights, National Labor Relations Act, right? It's NLRA rights. Like, we are walking out. We will be back at 1 p.m. They kind of demonstrated in front of the store, and this led to months of back and forth about Starbucks claiming about all this like violence and hitting cars with their picket signs and stuff from the workers. It was part of a complaint filed to the NLRB by Starbucks against the Denver store and against the Starbucks union, the national union. And, the workers say like, yeah, we booed some cars who broke the picket line to go to the drive-through, but like, we weren't violent. And I wasn't actually able to drive over for that, but the Guardian had a photographer there. And, I called him when all this came out. I was like, you were there for hours. Like, did you see any of this stuff? And he's like, no, they just like chanted and booed some cars. And, some people yelled at him and then it was over. Yeah. So it is a bit of a he said, she said, but, the workers say it's just completely fabricated. Was their description of the claims from Starbucks about what happened that day.
And there's been a few
of that, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, man.
Well, I was going to say, I think we heard similar thing was the John Deere strike where they're always looking for an excuse to limit like picket sizes and stuff like that. And they'll like any old shit they'll make.
Alabama, same thing.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, they cut them down to like one person allowed to be on the picket line because of complete bogus stuff. They're not the sidetrack, but like complete bogus stuff there, including the fact that it was like the union workers themselves who were getting run over and plowed into by pickup trucks, not the union organizers causing any trouble. But they're like, so like Starbucks has filed their complaint, but the workers too have filed with the NLRB, right?
Many times. Yeah. So by my count, there are at least 4, and I think there's a couple more coming. They're called ULPs, unfair labor practice complaints that you file with the NLRB, from this store alone. And late last week, it was announced that the NLRB is investigating over 200 instances of unfair labor practices, mostly based around some of those early campaigns in Buffalo. And my sense of it, I mean, if you go on the NLRB website, you can look at them, and it's just like several per day from Starbucks workers directed at the company. I mean, they're just pouring in from all over the country, and the NLRB's been underfunded by both administrations for decades. I just don't think they have the capacity to investigate all of these. But they have announced this huge, 200 is a lot, which is pretty huge investigation of Starbucks. And that followed on the heels of a lawsuit over, I think it was like 19 instances of the Starbucks employee handbook that violated various aspects of federal labor law. So, I mean, they've been seemingly violating labor laws right and left. And the consequences are starting to come, but it's not clear what exactly this is going to do to prevent Starbucks from treating its employees this way in the short term.
Let's not forget, y'all, just going back to the conversation we had with you last time you were on, that Hillary Clinton was very seriously considering Howard Schultz to be labor secretary.
I saw that on Twitter the other day, and I kind of was like, that's got to be an Onion headline, right? Like, I didn't remember that from the campaign, but it turns out to be true.
It's pretty dark stuff.
Yeah. That is nuts. I just want to make one point about those nitpicky sort of rules. And you see this a lot in those, and there's like there's a sort of public justification for that sort of stuff. Like it's sort of like the broken windows policing. Like you take care of the small things and the big things will fall into place. Well, the dark side of both this and the broken windows policing thing is like actually when it comes time for the authorities to get people out of there that they don't want there because they're being a problem, for one reason or another, it gets reason for them to fire them, like or jail them in the case of a broken windows police. And so, and understanding that is like this is why they decide all of a sudden to start talking about name tags or tucking in your shirts or that stuff. It's because it's time for management to flex its muscle a little bit.
Right. So that thing I told you about with the taking food home. The guy, like I said, there's an audio recording of that interaction that we were able to get our hands on. And it was, he gets really mad and he says to the Starbucks investigator, like, there's a member of staff here who's homeless. And he's like, you're like, it's going to the food pantry. Like this box is going to the food pantry. Like we literally have a staffer here who doesn't have a home. And rather than, kind of engaging with that, the Starbucks investigator starts demanding the name of the employee who's homeless, which the barista who I interviewed does not provide. But yeah, I mean, just, these tiny infractions that, the focus was on the tiny infractions rather than the fact that with a Starbucks salary, one of their employees didn't have a place to live in this city. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Well, before we go to I just wanted to ask just really quick, has there been much in the way of community support in this? We've seen different levels in different parts of the country, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the day of the strike, there were some other local unions that turned out and stood on the picket line. It seemed like a mixed bag that day. So there was some community support. I know the Denver DSA has been coming by and, kind of making sure to buy coffee and tip well. And I think they showed up the day of the strike too. I know that also the day of the strike, there were some people who yelled at them and crossed the picket line and someone threw an egg at them from a nearby
Jesus
building.
Christ.
And then, I know that a few, just kind of, and this has been happening around the country, people come in and say, hey, we hear you're unionizing and, put their order name as like pro-union or something on the app, like little stuff like that, that has been happening. I know that one of the baristas I talked to, she said that she had some friends in the Denver teachers union and that the teachers union turned out the day of the strike. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's been like an outpouring of either way of like positive or negative, but I've definitely heard some kind of nice little anecdotes of support.
Well, I want to kind of jump in there because you have a little bit on the sort of Wild West and sort of versus the labor culture dichotomy. Yeah. And I'm from North Dakota, and I feel like the similar sort of thing there. The only people I knew that had were in unions was like the train engineers, like those sorts of folks. But I worked at a coffee shop in Fargo, and the thought of unionizing, like it even like at a point where I was becoming politically aware and pro-union, theoretically, I never like thought to apply it to my situation there at all. And so I'm just curious, like, just to comment on the sort of like because they cite the National Labor Relations Act when they do that strike, like that implies some sort of awareness of labor rights there. So what's like the labor culture situation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and definitely one of the reasons I got into this story. So, I mean, in terms of the labor rights stuff, I mean, the Starbucks union's an affiliate of the SEIU, one of the biggest, the largest service worker union in the country. So, I mean, their lawyers and org are doing and inform the workers of their rights. But, Denver's really interesting. It's a democratic city in a state that's trended blue from purple or red over the past 20 or 30 years. but the labor culture it can be kind of sparse sometimes, and the rate of unionized workers in Colorado is below that of the national average. It's a modified right to work state, so it's not a full right to work law, but it's like a half right to work law. So if it's a unionized shop and you're an employee, you do not have to join the union or pay dues, even if the union is bargaining on your behalf, or advocating for benefits on your behalf. And this is that thing about Colorado, is that like you're saying, so there are a couple exceptions, right? So there is a service worker union, the UFCW, that represents like tens of thousands of Kroger and like King Soopers supermarket employees, and they did a big walkout over the winter. It was a huge strike. It was like 8,000 employees. But they go all the way back to the 1870s and something called the Amalgamated Meat Cutters. So unless it's a union from like way back in the day, the big industries in Colorado's Front Range tend not to be unionized. And this goes back to kind of the way the economy developed in this region since World War II. A lot of the mines shut down. The gold deposits had been tapped out, and there was a big silver crash in the 20s and 30s. So a lot of the mines had closed. World War II happens, and there's just, like the rest of the Sun Belt, there's this huge influx of investment into the federal highway system. Military infrastructure is giant on the Front Range. And, this kind of very deregulated pro-business culture develops, which is still very much kind of Denver's core economy today. And this gets tied in with what I talked to one of the UFCW directors from the grocery store union. He said this is related to Denver's idea of itself as a cowboy town. It's got this big rodeo every winter, and the Christmas lights don't come down until the rodeo in January. And that kind of like Western mythology, rugged frontiersmen, all that stuff that, is completely disconnected from the realities of settlement of the West. People, whether consciously or not, it is kind of the air people breathe, in Denver a lot of the time. And that is used by I talked to a labor historian who said this trope is pretty common in Western employers who kind of use this to, subtly or not so subtly, getting in the way of labor organizing. And then in the subtle sense that, like unions are cultural things. Like if you know someone in a union, if your parents were in a union, you're probably going to be more to labor organizing. And if labor culture is really weak, it's kind of hard to, you don't even kind of think about, I talked to one of the baristas who grew up in a suburb of Denver called Golden. She was a teacher and got a job at Starbucks, to elementary school teacher, to supplement that income. And she had been a barista at Starbucks for 6 years. And so before the union thing, and she said, it kind of never even crossed my mind. Like I hadn't met any union folks in my life. And so it was this like huge mental transition for her to be like, do I sign a union card or not? And at first she was like, no, like, I don't want to be fired. I don't want to lose my benefits. And she eventually came around, but I do think that her experience was somewhat emblematic of the Colorado Front Range at large, where it's just that, like, it's not even negative towards unions. It's just like an absence of them makes it that much harder to get people who when labor just isn't part of their day to day, to say, like, I'm going to put my name on a union card, send a letter to the bosses, put my name out there, risk being fired, and stand with my coworkers. Like, that was a mental transition for her. And I think she was not the only one in that workplace who kind of had to go through some version of that.
Well, I mean, I'd just be, curious to hear you expand on this a little bit more too, because, while there is that disconnect, and, there's differences in different states with their history. I mean, there is a history there in Colorado,
Yeah.
like the Ludlow Massacre that happened there. And I mean, I want to hear about Colorado, but it reminds me like a lot of some of the stories you read about in Texas history. Well, you don't read about them in high school or anything like that. But if you're somebody like me who likes to, read different history books, you're like, wow, there was a very, very radical and organized group of people in different times, from things like what you would expect, oil and gas, but also cowboys getting together, the fence cutting wars, and like there is this kind of radical history there that is just like not really a part of most people's awareness, even people who have like deep roots in these states, and might even be related to some of these people. Anyways, but I'd be curious to hear you expand a little bit more on like the Ludlow Massacre and some of that kind of forgotten history as well.
Yeah, so the Ludlow Massacre was a incident in 1913 in the southern Colorado coalfields, when there was this general strike in coal, targeting the coal company owned by the Rockefeller family. And they kind of they hired the Pinkertons and kind of famous union busting private armies. And there was an encampment of the miners and their families in this town called Ludlow. And there one day, the guards employed by the mining company, advanced on the camp and opened fire and ended up killing over 20 people, including, like almost, I think it was like 10 children of the miners. And this sets off it's part of like this, I think it was almost a 2-year, on and off, they call it the Coalfields War. But it sets off like pretty literal war. This 10-day battle where, these miners who tended to go on strike about once a decade in Colorado, and is usually pretty violent. Like they were veterans of the mine wars. They start this guerrilla campaign. They destroy company towns and mining infrastructure. They fought with the state National Guard. I think there ended up being more people killed in what followed the Ludlow Massacre than actually the Ludlow Massacre itself. And it only ends when federal troops from Leavenworth, Kansas are on the train to Colorado, and so the mining unions don't have any control anymore. Like the UMWA was telling them to stop. The miners are just doing their own thing. And when federal troops are coming in, they kind of do like one more wave of destruction and then go home. And it's this huge, the consequences are kind of all over the place. Like the Rockefellers debut company unions after this, like, which are now illegal, but
they're trying to bring them back, though.
They're trying to bring it back, yeah. But this was one of the results of Ludlow. Congress does a big investigation into Ludlow with uncovering all these abuses. But then there's also a kind of anti-labor backlash. The next election, they had elect a kind of pro-business governor who was supported by businesses who kind of thought Colorado's reputation had been tarnished. And they set up this like labor commission where there are labor representatives seated on the commission, but it is ultimately controlled by the state, and the companies are well represented, and it kind of ultimately becomes a way to curb union action, especially the more militant varieties. And the Colorado unions were really strong, really well organized in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. And just, willing to like really throw down with the companies. There are kind of a few more spurts of that in the 20s. But the state basically like deindustrializes in the 20s and 30s. In part because of just like the availability of some of the minerals, and in part because of market stuff. And in part, in some ways, because of the labor unions were stomped on a little bit. And that leads to that economic transition that I mentioned after World War II, that it becomes this kind of like, representative Sunbelt hub for business and, military investment. And the radical labor history kind of gets left behind. But this one historian I talked to, he's a professor at Bucknell, who wrote a book about Rocky Mountain labor history, said that one of the interesting things is that the strike that led to Ludlow, the workers were striking for labor laws that were already on the books. like no script, 8-hour workday, basic workplace protections. And, a lot of the stuff that the Starbucks employees have felt like that they've been retaliated against for, are also things that are, labor action that are supposed to be protected. In both cases, the companies know that if they get put at risk.
Yeah, no, just, a suggestion for folks, if you haven't read Mike Davis's Prisoners of the American Dream, he has an argument in there that I just think is really strong, where a lot of people say, oh, well, why has there not been like a strong labor party in America? Or why is our labor movement not like in other countries? And like the reality is, it's not been a case of absence of it, but rather like whenever there were these big confrontations, they got crushed, and like the state gets involved and plays a massive role in trying to destroy not just the immediate negotiating circumstances, but basically tries to destroy the unions,
and then gets lost to history. Is one you're mentioning that radical history in Texas. I was thinking about myself. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I remember reading this book by I'm sure you guys have heard of great indigenous scholar Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and her dad was ended up being kind of like racist white guy at the end of his life, but when he was younger was a member of the Wobblies. And she kind of writes this personal memoir about how his own personal transition as a history of Oklahoma. But I remember reading that book, and there's this thing called the Green Corn Rebellion, which is this socialist multiracial uprising against the federal government. And it's just like this, between that and Ludlow and some of this other stuff, you really do kind of have to stumble across it, because you're not going to learn it in, your general school history class in elementary school. And I just remember reading that and just this is a very different picture of Oklahoma than I had. And you kind of get a little fondness for it. And then it's also sad that feels completely disconnected from reality.
But I mean, it can play a big role too in reminding folks that we're not alone, and that there's a tradition to stand
Definitely.
on.
Yeah. If it's happened before, it can happen again. And those examples are really important.
Well, on this, before we roll, just going back to the Starbucks example, because we're not trying to pump people out, but we have to remind folks of these stakes are high. And there's been a lot of focus on the success of these run-ins. I'm sorry, the success of these, these union drives. But that's just the beginning of the battle, right? And we're seeing, in other places where they have won, that Starbucks is trying to play hardball when it comes to negotiating a contract.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's been a lot of excitement around the sort of people who support, the labor unions, that the Starbucks has kind of gone from 0 to 60 so quickly. And it is inspiring. I mean, the pace of this thing is really quite remarkable. But, there are thousands and thousands of Starbucks stores in the U.S., and we're at hundreds of stores with active campaigns, not even wins. We're at less than 100 wins. So every union win is significant, but in some ways that's just a really important milestone on a long process, because then you have to enter into collective bargaining. And, the way Starbucks has treated the Buffalo store, there have been continued firings of organizers. And also just that aspect you mentioned earlier of just being able to wait out people, that, they can stall and, get to an impasse in the labor negotiating process and kind of continue pulling all sorts of anti-union tactics in the meantime, and just exhaust people, and people leave, and new people have to step in. I think the collective bargaining process is just going to be really quite brutal with Starbucks. And the SEIU, like I said, I mean, they're the giant established union. They have really good lawyers, but I think it's important to have some sense of where we're at in the process. It's definitely not, these benefits that the workers are so excited about are not here. And in some ways of thinking about it, they're not all that close. There's a lot of work ahead. There's already been potentially, I've seen stuff about the Amazon union win, and Amazon is now challenging it, and people are being fired. And just the fact that a workplace will vote to unionize does not mean that any sort of finish line has been reached.
But I mean, it's a starting point, and like this is, the advantages we have
hugely
here.
important.
Oh no, I know, yeah, I'm not saying that you're not saying. I mean, it's like it's a starting point, and two, like this is like for the listener, people who are listening to this, like Starbucks relies on being thought of as a progressive corporation. Like that's their big thing. They've made bank off of that, and I think making sure that like we're supporting them as they're coming in, right, the early steps of unionization, and then supporting them at the negotiating table as well is really, really critical, because that's the only way that we'll be able to overcome a very powerful corporation like that, is just having constant eyes on the ground and actual support for people when they're requesting in your community, because it's a long fight, and yeah, they have every advantage, and especially in the ability to wait these things out, which just requires that we get excited and celebrate, but not get misty eyed, where we're sort of sitting back and thinking things are done before they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the fact that there were 0 Starbucks unionized as of November of 2021, like the excitement is certainly, and the surprise and the just the kind of pleasant air of pleasant surprise about how well this has gone is definitely warranted. But it's a very important step in a very long process, and it is in the company's interest to wait them out as long as possible, and they have the advantage in that sense when it comes to bargaining. So that's the next thing to watch.
So when this comes out, we'll hopefully have a sense of the tally. So I won't put you in the position of having to make a bold prediction, but if you could give us a sense as to, maybe what the feeling is going into, the tallying of the vote, that'd be really great. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's always a little nerve-wracking to run a story before you know the results, but you want people to read it. I have been asking all along, and trying to interview people who weren't just unions, like uncomplicated union supporters from day one, as many employees as I could. I didn't get to all of them. But, over and over and over, people were just, even when there were workers leaving and people getting fired, everyone just remained very confident that they had a pretty significant majority. And, towards the end of the process, when people were talking about how exhausted they were and how, the workplace had become really unpleasant, I said, is this going to impact things? And he said, the couple people said, the sense we get is that these demoralizing tactics, I mean, they've definitely made us unhappy. Like, work kind of sucks more than it used to now, but they're aware that it's the company doing it to them, not their fellow employees. Even if, you have a shitty shift and you get annoyed at, the other baristas, that the conditions that they're working in are kind of being inflicted on them from above for the union thing. So the sense that I got from, multiple people was that these tactics were probably making it only more likely that they will vote to unionize. So we'll see what happens, but that's what my reporting so far has indicated. And if I'm wrong, we'll have to do another story on what happened.
Well, Nick, it's always a pleasure having you on Left Reckoning. People can read Nick at High Country News. The piece is in The Guardian, Pure Propaganda Inside Starbucks Anti-Union Tactics. Highly suggest people read it, one for this breakdown and two for the labor history that we get there. You can find ways to follow Nick also in the show notes below. Thanks so much, brother.
Thank you. This was fun.
Yes, folks. Good, How do I sound, by the way, Dave? Am I sounding okay?
You're a little mumbled.
Okay, well, I'll go back to normal.
You sound better now. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, you got to go back. Sorry, Matt.
Damn it.
It really is, though, always such a treat to have Nick on. His reporting is always extremely thorough, and he brings a great perspective. And I mean, this story is, one that is really exciting to continue to cover. Particularly because it's just like immediately useful in the sense that, the kind of tactics they're using in Denver, the same they're using in Memphis and Buffalo and Arizona, all across the country. So it's like very helpful to put that out there for folks.
And it's amazing to see it catch on in real time, like to hear like that those workers were inspired by Buffalo, and that it's just like examples. That's where
Hmm.
people are getting inspired because they're realizing it is applicable to their situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, totally. And like, this is, I mean, we talked a little bit about the difficulties of the second step, which is winning contracts with Starbucks. And they've shown every inclination that they're going to try to fight the shit tooth and nail. But continuing to, rack up these victories, especially unanimous ones like this, is just so crucial and so important. And hell yeah, I mean, congratulations to the folks in Denver. I mean, they faced an uphill battle and they won.
And the calling out or the going on strike, I think. I
Hmm.
mean, just that stuff is. It's not emphasized enough how much shit people have had to go through. I mean, we hinted at it a little bit talking about the Great Recession and all that stuff. But like, I mean, it's always sucked. But the pandemic put a whole lot of stress on folks, especially this like the fucking mask stuff, where you
Hmm.
had these fucking tense interactions that you have to enforce. And yeah, like I mean, somebody like getting a tooth chipped by somebody over that stuff. I mean, really, it really upsets me.
Absolutely,
Frankly.
man. Well, we got a couple more stories we're going to get to, but just a reminder, if y'all want more, we're going to be talking Bitcoin in the post game, the kind of fallout from the price drop there. And you can join us in the post game at patreon.com/left reckoning immediately after this live show. Leave us a voicemail at 1-940-289-7234. We always love hearing from y'all, and it's always really nice when we have a inbox full of y'all's messages. So give us a call.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about we touched on the Roe versus Wade overturning decision leak a little bit last week, and sort of some of the ramifications of it. I did not know this about my sister state, Montana, but
Hmm.
they have a similar situation with regards to the right to privacy, protecting women's right to an abortion. There was a case in 1995 where they found that. Now, it's interesting how this happens because that's the right to privacy is the same basis that Roe was decided. The people who brought this case initially tried on the grounds of you're doing this to stop this service.
Hmm.
And the Supreme Court's like, nope, you didn't show that, prove that, even though explicitly that's what these anti-choice folks are doing. That wasn't good enough for the court, so they went back on this right to privacy and got that enshrined into the state constitution. So that's what's going on here with this Montana abortion rights governed by the state law, not SCOTUS. Now, I just want to zoom in on what one of this pro-life guy is saying here. His name is Laszlowski for Montana, Montana Family Foundation. So after the draft leaked, anti-abortion advocates in Montana became cautiously optimistic, said Jeff Laszlowski, which I think goes to the point where I think this leak was clearly like, get the troops ready for the coming assault instead of like warn people to, which is what we still need to do in response to it for the coming assault. But and all of the stuff where Republicans are acting outraged is just acting. Um, if the draft becomes a final court opinion, the fight for illegal abortion would pivot back to the state level, Laszlowski said. This is due to a 1999 Supreme Court decision in Armstrong v. State, which said the right to privacy in Montana Constitution gave women the right to decide whether to have an abortion without excessive interference by the government. This allowed women to have an abortion prior to fetal viability.
Hmm.
Since the decision was handed down, any new restrictions on abortion passed by the Montana state legislature are tested against the Armstrong ruling. Armstrong, Laszlowski said, put us in a box. For Laszlowski, the two paths to make abortion illegal in Montana are either to amend the state constitution to no longer protect abortion or replace the entire Montana Supreme Court and get it to nullify Armstrong. Now, I think this is just a useful story for a couple of reasons. One, on your basic like arguing with family members type of thing, where it's like with the sanctity of the Constitution, this, that, and the other, right? If they believe, like, just I mean,
Hmm.
first of all, the Supreme Court of the United States is an example enough to how willing they are to fudge things. But this is a very clear example. Like, either we get the power to amend the Constitution, or we'll impeach these motherfuckers out of here and get in some guys that are going to do the bidding. Now, I will just say for the record, I approve of both of those things for in service of ends that are hideous and anti-women, right? If this was to do like no the state doesn't do any business with a company unless it's unionized. That I would support ejecting Supreme Court or enshrining the Constitution. I think that all that stuff's great, but you need to point out like how their willingness to go fucking get it. And I mean, that is like outside of the ideological thing, just looking at this stuff, like the Democrats, it's very clear that there is a paralysis somewhere in the action department. And it's exactly like the Civil War, like George McClellan fucking leading the troops, right? It's like, what's this army for? And I wanted to bring that to folks' attention. And I mean, there's multiple bills already working their way through Montana's legislature, anti-abortion stuff, regardless of this state ruling. So, the assault is still on.
And I mean, I just wanted to note, I mean, that's a good point to make about the Supreme Court in Montana. That like, people need to stop letting the right get away with this framing, that they're the party of small government, that they're the party of respecting the rule of law, whatever it may be. They understand that they want to stack the deck in their favor. And I mean, I think that it would be good if the left took that position, as well as understand that these things are political and politicized. And we should be fighting for the results that we want. And even beyond that, just like stop this fucking fantasy game where you just sort of act like these people's principles aren't constantly shifting. Because the right has shown anything, at least in my lifetime, that it's willing to completely shift to whatever is most favorable to it at a certain time. I mean, like, liberals would make this point about, I mean, during the when they were stealing the Supreme Court seat, people would be like, "Oh, look at this Republican saying something different 30 years ago," right? And it's like, "Oh, we got him in a trap of their own words." It's like, no, they're shifty because they want to win, and they understand that these are games of fights about power. And stop playing this game that like, oh, the Republican Party one day used to be, a party of morals and small government and the rule of law. That's absolute bullshit. They understand when the terrain's shifting, and they're going to shift their messaging and their arguments in that circumstance. And yeah, I mean, from the Supreme Court fights to Greg Abbott here in Texas when it comes to COVID and centralized power, like, stop accepting their bullshit framing on these things.
And what would that look like? We had Liz Franzik of a True Anon podcast on TMBS, I'm pretty sure, back in the day to talk about this. But just to remind folks, she had this tweet from 2020. So this is October 20th, 2020. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy announces the Reproductive Freedom Act, legislation that will codify Roe and repeal some restrictions on abortion. New Jersey is the first state to announce legislation to protect and expand access to abortion in the wake of RBG's death. And Liz points out, good, but why stop there? If you're going to legislate, then legislate an actual positive right, because Roe doesn't do that. Roe only guarantees access to a market. It says the state will not intervene in your ability to obtain which is to say purchase an abortion in the place. It does not guarantee that the state facilitates your ability to exercise your right. This is why Roe has been killed by 1,000 cuts. And this is exactly right. Like, we tried this thing, the right to privacy thing. It needs to be a right to an abortion. Yeah. And we talked about this with Dominique Remy too, about all the other things that are involved in making this an actual right for folks. And it doesn't just stop at this right to privacy. It starts to making this an affirmative right that is materially delivered to people as a service.
And like, this is like an important point too, is that like, when it comes to abortion for millions and millions and millions of working class and poor women, I mean, it has effectively been outlawed for them because either they don't get access to that healthcare through their insurance system, or it's prohibitively priced for them. I'm sure I'm not alone in being in the experience of getting together with friends to pull together $50 from a few different people so that one of your friends could get an abortion because they couldn't afford the price up front. Right. And that is something that I think is felt and experienced by many, many people in this country. And it's lucky if you have a large friend network that can help you out in that situation, or great nonprofits that are bravely standing up and trying to support people, to get this thing. But yeah, like, the right to a market is not the same thing as the right to a basic medical procedure like that. And yeah, the framing needs not just framing in the way that we argue about it, but the actual politics and policy around that needs to shift dramatically. Like we
Yeah, and I
can't
think
just go back is what I'm saying. At
yes,
this point, like we can't just go back to the status quo because it wasn't good enough then. And if the whole thing's under threat now, it's time to get much bolder and braver and provide much more for people.
yeah, like that's the results, right? Like it would have been nice if that was the way to have preserved it. It failed. That way failed, and there's no going back there. And like there needs to develop in this country a more consciousness that sort of thing. Like we need to start fighting for positive rights.
Yeah. Well, y'all, before we go to the post game, we have one more story, and I'm sorry, it's it's a sad one, but it's important to highlight this and to talk about this. Recently, in Jenin, Shireen Abu Akleh, who is a Palestinian American journalist for Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English, was shot in the head by Israeli forces. She was the murders by the Israeli military on unarmed civilians are tragic in and of themselves, but this one's extremely egregious because this is somebody who was very clearly wearing a press uniform, helmet, shirt that clearly identified them as press. This is not the first time that the IDF has killed journalists in Palestine. Unfortunately, that is a much more frequent occurrence than it should be. The United States has been absolutely silent. You go and you read most of the media here or watch most of the coverage. It's as if there's just flying bullets, as if they're just like bees or bugs, just like flying through the air. Where did the bullet come from? Right? Somebody got shot, and there's never a perpetrator. There's never an active element that shot somebody. And it's absolutely, it's immoral and it's evil. And it shows something that is so cynical about the United States government right now, that we say that if you're an American citizen, that we take deaths abroad seriously and we will investigate and we will put pressure on governments. Unless it seems if you are Palestinian American, then your life doesn't matter. Then we will allow the Israeli government to do its own investigation, which I don't think I need to instruct people about. The Israeli government has a very, very horrific track record with covering this kind of shit up. And again, none of this would happen if these territories weren't occupied in the first place. We have this video here, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts too, Matt. But this is from Al Jazeera. Sorry, the audio quality is a little low here. But this is one of the members this is one of Shireen's co-journalists responding live to her shooting and murder by the IDF.
Shireen Abu Akleh, who has been covering the events unfolding in Jenin, specifically an Israeli raid to the city in the north of the occupied West Bank, where she was hit by a bullet to the head. She was transferred to the hospital. Our colleague and producer Rania has been in touch with the hospital before the announcement of the death. The medical team told her that she had a very, very slim chance. And unfortunately, we just got the news from the Palestinian Health Ministry announcing her death. As you can imagine, it gave us a shock to the journalists who have been working with her. She's a very well-respected journalist. She's been covering the Palestinian story for years and years now. Since she has joined Al Jazeera since the beginning of the second Intifada. She's been covering on the news. And we are now very shocked, very sad that this is the reality of Palestinian journalists covering the news, that unfortunately they find themselves part of the story.
Nida, I understand, of course, that this is Forgive me for interrupting you, Nida, but I do, of course, understand. We all do understand that this is a very difficult moment for you and the team there. Are you able to tell us any more about the circumstances under which this happened?
To be honest, Rob, I've seen a few videos. I couldn't continue watching them. As you can imagine, this is difficult. I've seen her shot in the head. That's all I've seen. I don't know the circumstances. I'm not sure where she was standing at the time. We're trying to leave to Jenin now to try and cover from there. But unfortunately, what we know at the moment is very little.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. This is just a continuation of the horror that everyday Palestinians face, and it's just the impunity with which this system is allowed to continue. The silence of the United States when it comes to, again, somebody who has American citizenship. The United States should care on a moral level, regardless of your citizenship status, but it just shows the deep level of the hypocrisy here and the willingness of this system to just stand up for occupation, dehumanization, and a constant state of war against Palestinian people. Many people, I know Jeremy Corbyn's come out and spoken out about this. I believe Tlaib as well. Ilhan Omar shared this today. She was killed in response to the Associated Press, which, by the way, let's talk for real about this. Media criticism is important, especially on moments like this. The Associated Press had their building, right, where they had their offices in Palestine, bombed by the IDF, right? At this point, it's like to try to, as the journalist said, there's like too often, Palestinian journalists have to become a part of the story, right? Because of the brutality of the occupation, because of the dehumanization of people. And the AP is another organization that has faced this kind of damage from Israel, which has shown that it is willing and it knows that it's going to be able to get away with this at this point. To treat and put journalists' lives in danger like this. So it just has to be known that, when you read these, statements from the Associated Press, this always, the agent is always out of the picture, right? Shireen was killed by gunfire in the occupied West Bank. Again, as if that's just like a naturally occurring phenomenon, not somebody pulling the trigger, somebody in a uniform, somebody with orders.
The New York Times headline was Shireen, trailblazing Palestinian journalist, dies at 51.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Lord. That's the worst. Jesus Christ. And, Jen Psaki, similar kind of thing. It's a big mystery as to how these people are being killed. But Ilhan Omar said she was killed by Israeli military after making her presence as a journalist clearly known. We provide Israel worth $3.8 billion in military aid annually with no restrictions. What will it take for accountability for these human rights violations? This is happening as Israel razed the homes of 40 Palestinians yesterday, leaving them homeless. And as they plan to evict 1,000 from the West Bank, the largest mass expulsion since 1967. Again, I ask, what will it take for real accountability? And those are very, very fair questions to be asked. It's a complete joke that we're continue to be in this situation. It's tough. Sorry, I get it makes me sad. But if there's any silver lining, it's just the people of Palestine just can't be broken. And, we just have to find ways to continue to support, and particularly if you're in the United States, to work to end the funding for this apartheid system, this murderous system that has brought so much death, destruction, and joylessness to people.
Yeah, it's a very instructive case, unfortunately. Like the habit of committing atrocities and then lying about it. And right now, the IDF and even Pelosi is collaborating a little bit when she says we need an investigation and doesn't call any party by name, right?
Yeah.
And the IDF saying, well, we think it might be some Palestinians and stuff like that. It's like, well, it's not. I think very clearly she was sniped by Israelis. But let's just say the journalist is like, I don't know the circumstances. Well, I can tell the circumstances in a way that journalists can't and have those jobs. So the circumstances is there's a violent apartheid state murdering people. That's the circumstances. And like Ilhan Omar said, evicting people from their homes. So let's just say hypothetically that there's a bullet flying from Palestine, which I believe this is a lie, to be clear. The larger context is still this apartheid state setting the context for this. It's just like how a lot of people have become really good at spotting like Russians when they commit atrocities in their invasion and lie about it, right? People are very quick to call that stuff out. This is the exact same thing.
Totally. I just also want to, report too that one of the other journalists with him was also shot in the back, but he seems to have survived. You can find interviews with him talking about what happened to them. I mean, it's very clear at this point. And I just must say to, people who in the United States who identify as liberal Zionists, who are coming and responding to this atrocity and saying, we need a full investigation before anybody can say something about this. Just know that you are making the exact same argument and you are acting in the exact same way as those nasty white supremacists who, whenever a black person is murdered by police departments across this country, says we can't know the facts until the entire court process has played out. It's bullshit. It's racist. It's dehumanizing. And you should be ashamed of yourself for playing that same kind of game. As people who you might condemn in other circumstances, right? It's absolute bullshit, and I have no patience for it, and I don't think anybody else should tolerate this anymore, because it's clear as day what is going on, and it's just unbelievable to be sitting here in 2022 and watching American tax dollars go to support this brutal system, and then watching people try to run interference for something that is quite clearly in front of your face a war crime.
Yeah, and it's just like clockwork too. Every spring, there's more.
It's canned. It's yeah. All right, y'all. Well, we got fun stuff coming in the post game. I appreciate everybody hanging out with us. Nick was great. You can find his piece in the show notes below. I highly suggest reading it. So, plug for myself. Read my piece in Sublation magazine as well. You can find the show notes as well. Join us over at patreon.com/leftreckoning and leave us a voicemail at 1-940-289-7234. We got a lot coming up in the next hour or so, and then some really exciting shows coming up in the next 2 weeks too that we'll maybe give people a preview of in the post game as well. But I will see y'all then.